This is Terror House Radio with Matt Forney and Bryden Proctor.
Yeah, welcome to Terror House Radio episode number 69. I'm Matt Forney, charming and loquacious host. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Terror House Press. My co-host and producer, Bryden Proctor, will not be joining us. He's off at his Thursday night Bible study. Why his church does it on Thursdays is anyone's guess, but that's where he is. Our guest for this program is Chris Moran. He is a poet, author, and for the purposes of the show, he is the author of PSYCHE and SPECTER, which will be released tomorrow from Terror House Press. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I start off every first-time interview of a guest by letting them kind of define themselves in their own words, introduce themselves. So for the people in the audience who don't know who you are, Chris, could you just give a brief overview of yourself, your work, that kind of thing?
Yeah, sure. First, I want to say that I support going to Bible study, and I think that more people should do Bible study. But I'm a poet, musician. I've done a lot of creative stuff for over a decade now, probably like 15 years of writing, mainly poetry, occasionally like essays and critical reviews. I'm not really sure what else to say.
No, it's good enough. It's just kind of getting it out there. And you've mentioned to me that you work as a machinist. I don't know how relevant that is. If you want to talk about that, that the audience might find that interesting.
Oh yeah, it's something that I'm good at, and it's something that sort of suits me. It's something probably not a lot of poets out there work as machinists, but industrial manufacturing is something that's been a part of my life for a few years now. And I think a lot about like movement and motion and speed and how things move around, and try to visualize that in a certain way.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's definitely an unusual background for a poet. I mean, there's not many writers in our sphere who have that kind of background. I'm pretty solidly like middle class. My last dalliance into the working class life was when I was in the North Dakota oil fields close to a decade ago. But I'm
interesting. Like what do you do there?
It's a long story, but basically in 2012 I had the idea that I was going to hitchhike across the country. I started in my hometown of Syracuse, New York, and I ended up in Portland, Oregon about 6 months later. But for about 2 months, I was in the oil field because, well, I needed work. And this was during the kind of the height of the oil boom when you could, it's a bit of an exaggeration to say that you could, step off in Williston and get a job. But there was a lot of temp work available. It was flagging, digging ditches, which is something I did, for like $20 an hour, which was a lot more money back then. Even Walmart in Williston during that time was not only paying something like $25 an hour, they were paying for their employees' hotel rooms. Because the big problem in Williston and the other oil patch towns wasn't money. Like you could get a job very easily, but there was a severe housing shortage because so many people were moving in that a rent for like an apartment was something like $1,500, $2,000 a month. You'd have like 50 miles away, RV hookups would be like, $2,500 a month. So a lot of people would like sleep in their cars and such. One of my friends there joked that Williston is the only city in America where you can be homeless and you have $1,000 in your pocket. So that was my experience working in the oil fields. It kind of dried out because I was there from September to November. The jobs kind of started filtering out as we went into winter, just because construction stops, it gets snowy, etc. and there were some other political considerations as well. But it was an interesting experience. It's going to end up in a book, that I'm going to write at some point in the future. Actually, there's a really good documentary called The Overnighters, which focuses on a Lutheran church in Williston that allowed job seekers to sleep there overnight. They were called overnighters, and that was the focus of the documentary. Focuses on the pastor who ran it, who was someone I knew, and I actually met the filmmakers a couple of times when I was in Williston. I'm not in the movie, but a few people I know are in the movie, so that might be, if you're interested in the kind of the culture of the place as it was, during the height of the oil boom, I really recommend checking that movie out.
Nice. Yeah. I think that the sort of work that I do, some of that does end up in like oil, like drilling and oil refineries, stuff like that, construction equipment, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of the work I did was flagging, which was fairly simple in terms of like if you've ever been driving down a street that has like construction going on, and there's like the guys with like the signs that say like stop and then go, etc., controlling traffic. That's flagging. That wasn't too physically strenuous. The issue there is just that it's very, very boring because we're doing this out like in very rural areas. One of the hobbies we had was it's very windy out there because it's plains. There's no trees to block the wind. So you get these gale force winds. So like for whenever we got bored and there weren't any cars around to direct, we just walk out into the middle of a cornfield and just like when the wind came up, we just hold ourselves up and act like we were falling over. And the wind was strong enough that it would hold us up. So, but I've also there was digging ditches, which was kind of amusing because the workplace had only one shovel for me, a shovel that had been snapped in half. I also had to suit up in a hazmat suit in order to do this because we're working on like a hydrofracking rig, and those things spill a lot of toxins into the soil and whatnots. They had all these environmental concerns. So once you went into the ring surrounding the pipelines that they were building just above ground, you had to wear a suit in order to keep any toxins from entering your body.
Oh yeah.
And it's funny because the foreman came up to me later that day, and I apologized because I wasn't able to get that much work done. And he was like, dude, you're working with a broken shovel. You're like, this is as much as anyone could be expected to do in your position. It was interesting to be in that kind of environment where people were a bit, my observation was that people were a bit more open, a bit more direct than what I was used to from my I've been an office drone most of my life, so it's a very different culture.
Yeah. I mean, I can relate to that.
Yeah. So before we continue, I just want to remind everyone, if you have any questions for Chris or myself, you can send a tip to streamlabs.com/terrorhouse magazine, and we will read them later on the show. But let's get into talking about PSYCHE and SPECTER. You want to talk a bit about PSYCHE and SPECTER, Chris? What inspired you to write it, what it's about, that kind of thing?
Yeah, sure. It's a collection of poetry. I'm not sure if I told you this or not, but like most of it, I'd say about 90% of the book was written between like 2010 and 2014. So, some of the poems are like a decade old or even older than that. It took me a while to get it out there, but I would describe it as an abstract and dreamlike and metaphysical collection of poetry. There was a lot of stuff that I was reading at the time that inspired it. I think the title of the book came from, I was looking at this earlier today, a book called, actually a preface to Plato by Eric A. Havelock. And that's where this phrase, the ghost that thinks, comes from. This book is not actually like a preface to the philosophical work of Plato. I would describe it as more of like a companion piece to I'm not sure if this is the breakdown of the bicameral mind, if you're familiar
By
with that.
Julian Jaynes. Yes, I
Yeah,
read
yeah.
that when I was in college.
Yeah, I didn't read the whole thing. I read about half of it, and this book is actually very, very similar to that because it is more describing the mindset of like somebody in ancient Greece, and there were things that were described in a certain way that was very inspiring to me, and a lot of unusual ideas within this book, and um, it was just a good book.
I actually have the the passage from Preface to Plato that you referred to when you first pitched the manuscript to me last year. I'm actually going to read that to kind of give people a bit of a firmer grounding on what inspired you to write the book. But anyway, this is from Eric A. Havelock's Preface to Plato. At some time towards the end of the 5th century before Christ, it became possible for a few Greeks to talk about their souls as though they had selves or personalities which were autonomous and not fragments of the atmosphere nor of a cosmic life force, but what we might call entities or real substances. At first, this conception was within reach only of the more sophisticated. There's evidence to show that as late as the last quarter of the 5th century, in the minds of the majority of men, the notion was not understood, and that in their ears, the terms in which it was expressed sounded bizarre. Before the end of the 4th century, the conception was becoming part of the Greek language and one of the common assumptions of Greek culture. Scholarship has tended to connect this discovery with the life and teaching of Socrates, and to identify it with a radical change which he introduced into the meaning of the Greek word psyche. In brief, instead of signifying a man's ghost or wraith, or a man's breath or his life's blood, a thing devoid of sense and self-consciousness, it came to mean the ghost that thinks, that is capable of both of moral decision and of scientific cognition, and is the seat of moral responsibility, something infinitely precious, an essence unique in the whole realm of nature. That's the quote. Basically, what Havelock's discussing is the idea, sort of the conception. He's talking more or less about how the Greeks began to perceive consciousness in the context of the soul, and how that was bequeathed, I guess, all the way down to our present day. Whereas the soul was not just kind of some separated thing or some material thing, but it was something beyond. And consciousness is something, human consciousness is something that is beyond, the assertion here is something beyond our existing understanding. It's been discussed, but by other people, but there's no way to prove consciousness in an E = MC² world. It's something that human beings have, but can't really be quantified. And my understanding is that this, not this specific concept, but this passage and the conception of the soul and the psyche was what inspired you to write Psyche and Spectre.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying.
Sorry
to
for
look
unloading
at,
a lot on you right there.
I just thought that was great that you read that passage.
Well, it's a work that's a bit more abstract than what we've published at Terra House. So a work that I really like. It's a fantastic book, and you should all go buy it tomorrow. But this kind of gives you the grounding on what you were coming. On what you were trying to get across. And there are other influences that go there. One big influence, particularly in the early part of the book, is Hermann Hesse's novel Demian. In fact, we published an excerpt yesterday on the site, the poem Demian. And one interesting thing that I noticed about the book while I was editing it, you start off with a number of prose poems, and then your poetry tends to become more traditional with the line breaks and whatnot. Is there any particular reason why you decided to sort of write the book in this fashion? Because it starts with about half a dozen prose poems, and then it becomes more, I don't want to say traditional, but like more recognizable as poetry in that sense.
Yeah, that's true. I haven't really looked at it recently, so I'm not really sure. I wanted to sort of bring people into something more straightforward before going into the abstract stuff. Like be a little more straightforward, and then get a little weirder. Get into the more abstract stuff later on.
Kind of ease them into it.
Yeah.
Don't hit them all with the metaphysical right away. Just kind of just slowly lower them into the pot, and before you know it, you're talking about space travel and all this metaphysical stuff. I highlighted Demian as the poem to kind of put the excerpt on the site with, because I think it kind of demonstrates this approach. You get the themes of paranoia, conspiracy, the descent into the metaphysical. Because I haven't read the work that you were inspired by, as I said, Hermann Hesse's novel Demian. But even if you haven't, you really get the imagery here of a sort of a Mephisto-like figure coming into the protagonist's life, and just starting on this descent into metaphysical confusion, as it were.
Yeah. Well, that novel by Hermann Hesse, I read that probably over 10 years ago, and it's something that sort of stuck with me. And that poem is actually a dream. Like that's something that actually occurred to me, and I wrote it down exactly as it happened.
Oh, that's interesting. It's kind of like Kubla Khan, if he hadn't been interrupted in the middle of writing it. I didn't know that came from a dream. I mean, the poem talks about it being a dream, but I didn't know that it was a dream that you had.
Yeah, it is a dream that I had, and I wrote it. I think it exactly as it happened. Yeah, so I think that Kubla Khan, that is a pretty accurate description.
Yes, and with regards to to kind of circle back to the Havelock passage that I read and that you shared with me to kind of introduce me to the book. As you described, the book gets more metaphysical and abstract as it goes on, and you also referred to the breakdown of the bicameral mind. What sort of philosophy or ideas were you hoping to kind of convey to the reader through your exploration of these themes in the book? I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't read it, which right now isn't anyone, because it's not out yet, aside from the wonderful people who blurbed it. But what kind of thrust or ideas or themes were you sort of going for when you put the book together?
I was just inspired by sort of abstract and dreamlike metaphysical sort of ideas. A lot of stuff that was later on described in this book by Eric A. Havelock. I know that Plato was like a big critic of poetry in the Republic. I think that he wanted to sort of do away with poets, kick them out of the Republic.
Yeah, he wasn't much for that. He wasn't much for that kind of thing. He was a bit more utilitarian, to put it in that sense.
Yeah, and I've been trying to figure that out for a while now, and I don't, if anyone has some insight into that, like, reach out to me, because one thing that's discussed later on in this book is that poetry is a corruption of the intellect, and I think that might be true in a lot of cases, to be honest. I think that poetry can be harmful to people. I don't know where else to take that, but it can be a corruption of the intellect, and that what he goes into like Homer and describing things with images, and how images can guide a story. But I'm not a novelist, I'm a poet, so I'm not telling a story. I'm just using images and abstract ideas. Um,
that's an interesting thing to bring up, the idea of poetry as corrupting. I see a parallel here with the way Plato kind of interpreted poetry. With say you can find this in say Catholic theology, the idea that indulging in the imagination too much can separate you from God, because instead of focusing on what is real and what can be quantified, um, you kind of get lost in your own headspace, and
oh yeah.
yeah, and you can drift down the path of sin. Um, there's I forget the exact term. I'm no theologian by any means, but I remember reading years ago that according to the Catholic Church, as you get closer and closer to God in your prayers and in your interpretation of the world, your senses get progressively shut off. Your imagination is kind of switched off as part of the process, because the imagination in their conception is what can lead you down the path of Satan. One extreme example of this is called the dark night of the senses, when God himself will cut access to you as a way to test your faith. These people who, priests, monks, etc., who pray a lot, and get closer to God through their isolation from the world, eventually God, to test their faith and prove that they can continue to worship him without the training wheels, as it were, will just stop responding to them. A famous person who suffered from this was Mother Teresa. She admitted in her private writings that decades before she died, she stopped feeling the presence of God in her life. The test there in the conception, in the Catholic conception, is whether you can keep praying and keep on that path without having the constant encouragement from God. I see a parallel there in what you refer to as the corruption of poetry. Now, obviously, I'm not saying I agree with the Catholic theology or even really understand it all. I'm no theologian, but the idea that the imagination can lead you down some pretty interesting paths, some pretty odd paths, and poetry is one unique way that it expresses itself, because poetry is all about the specific wording, the line breaks, painting abstract images, as you said, in the person's mind.
Yeah, and that was really interesting. All that stuff about the Catholic Church and theology and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, because it's obviously not the same tradition, but a lot of Greek and Roman thought went into Christianity in general. There's a lot of that in Christianity. With regards to your influences, we discussed Havelock, we discussed Hess. What other writers, what other poets would you state had a significant influence on your writing style and those topics you write about?
There's this one author I like a lot, even though I've only read one book by him, Charles Upton. I read a book by him called What Poets Used to Know, and it's basically about what poets used to know, that poetry in like the ancient world and like the Greek and Roman world, they knew things that they don't know now, and he goes into that a lot. Just like Pindar and other ancient Greek poets, just that there was something that they knew that a lot of poets are not aware of now.
Just this sort of intangible, like, knowledge conception of the
Yeah,
world.
yeah, and I like one idea in that book that sort of stuck with me is the idea that like the ultimate audience for a poet is God. That like poets are ultimately writing directly to God. That it doesn't really matter who the audience is because a poet is ultimately speaking to God, and that is something that stuck with me.
That's an interesting thing because that's a common trope you'll find across certain types of people. The idea that art or literature or any kind of creative endeavor, the ultimate audience is God, and the ultimate purpose is to glorify God. There's been different interpretations across different peoples, throughout the centuries of this. You'll have all the Renaissance art was stuff like the Sistine Chapel was all about glorifying God through these beautiful paintings and statues. Then you had iconoclastic Christians come along and say that that all those were graven images, and you can't do that kind of thing. You have an interpretation of this in the Muslim world where depictions of Muhammad are not allowed. But there's a general current across all these cultures, and then you get away from Abrahamic religions. You'll see the same thing in places like India, or to a lesser extent China, places that are not that don't have religion in the way that Westerners perceive it. The idea that through creating you're supposed to honor and venerate the supernatural world, God or the gods or whoever. And I know the name Charles Upton. It's not ringing a bell. I may have read some things of his in college, but it's very distant. But interesting. That's interesting. The idea that basically what he's getting at, what they've lost is just kind of this conception of the supernatural, and the idea that your work should serve a higher purpose. Literature and art these days is much more materialistic in that sense. And I think, I haven't read the book, but I think that's what he's getting at here. And that it was a discussion I was having with a friend a while back, with regards to how slavery is depicted in popular culture, has been depicted in popular culture and American culture, going back to the abolitionist era. Abolitionists made the argument that slavery was immoral because black people had souls, and it was wrong to enslave another man. It was wrong it was morally wrong on that level. But to kind of go to the point you had with the absence of God and art and whatnot, because we live in a more materialistic era, the whole concept of the soul, etc., doesn't really exist. So you'll get something like 12 Years a Slave, where slavery is depicted almost entirely in corporeal terms, like in terms of the physical abuses inflicted upon slaves, which are always very extreme. And I'm not this is not a defense of slavery, but in the 1800s, the argument against slavery was that it was just morally wrong on the basis of black people have souls. You can't enslave someone with a soul. That's an affront to God. It was not really focused on physical abuses to that degree. And that just comes, I think, from, again, the shift to a more materialist view in society. The idea that if you excise kind of the soul, the supernatural, the metaphysical element of it, you have to, and you interpret everything in terms of the material world. You have to heighten up physical abuses, physicality, to sort of cartoonish levels. It's also very Foucaultian. I'm mispronouncing it. Michel Foucault, biopower. And we've discussed this on the show before about Foucault's influence on postmodernism and modern art and modern culture.
Oh yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on all of this?
No, I'm not really a fan of Michel Foucault, but the idea of like you can be a slave in your body, but What was the other like thing about slavery? Like you can sort of be a slave in your soul or something to things that are outside of yourself.
Yeah, yeah. You can, your body can be enslaved, but your soul can be free. And you can be, and on the other flip side, you can be physically free, but you can be enslaved to, whatever vices or propaganda has kind of gone into your brain.
Yeah.
Which is a conception that's totally missing, these days, with regards to people just interpret. It goes back to again, all the material nature of everything, the material nature through which we conceive of the world. And I'm interested in Upton now. I'm definitely going to check out that book you recommended.
Yeah. What poets used to know. That's the only one that I've read so far. I mean, he's got a book that's called like The System of the Antichrist, or I think that's the title. The System of the Antichrist, and a few others, and they all sound really interesting. I'd love to get him to read Psyche and Specter if he's interested. I think he's in his like 70s now. He's a fascinating author with a lot of interesting ideas.
Well, actually, there's an idea. I'm going to see if I can track him down and offer him a copy, because I've actually done this before. Probably not the best to do it unsolicited, but sorry.
I would appreciate that. I mean, this guy's written about aliens. He's written about the Antichrist. He's written about ancient poetry, lots of other really interesting things. He's also got a book on Alexander Dugin, if you're familiar.
Oh God, yeah. I'm unfortunately familiar with Dugin through shall we say ex-associates of mine in the political sphere. But we're not going to get into that. I actually have a few of Dugin's books in my library. They were given to me by a friend in publishing about 3 years ago.
Oh yeah, I actually had one of those books and I sold it on eBay for a lot of money.
Really? I mean,
yeah. One of the ones that is no longer on Amazon, because for some reason you're not allowed to sell his books on Amazon.
Oh yeah, because I'm friends with the CEO of Arctos, who publishes Dugin's books in English. And about 3 years ago, Amazon just delisted all their Dugin titles because I guess Russian conspiracy or something, which is kind of laughable if you've actually gone into the philosophy of it, because Dugin's a troll basically. A lot of what he says is just kind of stuff he says to shock people. It doesn't really carry over into English because, a lot of the nuances are lost, which goes back to kind of a beef I have with people who get too into continental philosophy in general. I mean, I might be on the wrongs. This might be totally off base, but in continental philosophy, from Nietzsche to Camus and whatnot, there's kind of an element of playfulness, a sort of tongue-in-cheek approach to it. It's as much literature as it is philosophy, whereas in the English-speaking world, we tend to have a harder division between those two concepts. So you'll translate this stuff. People will translate this stuff into English, and then certain people will get a hold of it, and they'll be like, super serious. They'll take it too literally. Dugin very much writes in that tradition of just trying to be, like I said, he's really in many ways just a troll. But you carry that over to English, the nuances are lost, and people start taking it super seriously.
Yeah.
By the way, if you want to know, if you want a vision of what it's like when someone takes Dugin a bit too seriously, check out the book Dragon Day by Matthew Pegas, which is available from Terror House Press. It's a novel. It's a very funny novel.
I still have to read that one.
Oh, it's very good. I mean, I might, I had to interact with people like that, so I enjoyed it a bit more than the average person would. But it's very good, and it's from someone who did his homework. But yeah, with with regards to Upton, that's interesting. I mean, I'll actually try and track him down. We did actually send out some books unsolicited a year ago. I actually, with our book, Letters from a Heartbroken Pervert by Richard Power, which you should also buy, by the way. I actually sent it unsolicited to a bunch of porn companies, which you can do because legally they all have to have a custodian of records address. So I just by request of the author, I just sent it to the guy who does the Buttman videos. I sent a couple of copies to some porn producers in Montreal. No response yet, but I'm hoping someone at those companies enjoyed the book. Hopefully didn't leave the pages too sticky. Yeah. To kind of get back into Psyche and Spectre. With regards to kind of the imagery you use, it's very kind of focused on space and kind of the sort of not like a sci-fi sense, but like and obviously a more metaphysical sense, which you use these metaphors to kind of explain the sort of nature of consciousness, the sort of metaphysical themes you were heading towards. What sort of inspired you to kind of take this approach? Because it's obvious. Like I said, this is a book about metaphysics, but it's not something that's preachy. It's not something that would that kind of tell. It's something it just invites the reader into kind of this abstract world. Did anything in particular inspire you to kind of take this approach? And by the way, the approach was what inspired the cover art by Matt Lawrence, which you can see on screen right now. The sort of spacey tarot card theme.
There's a lot of ideas and a lot of stuff that I was interested in like 10 years ago or like a really long time ago that sort of stuck with me, and that's a lot of that inspired the poetry, like weird ideas about dreams and lucid dreaming and like geometric stuff and ancient Greek ideas, like the stuff that's in that Eric A. Havelock book about Plato. A lot of ideas like that. I'm not sure where else to take this, but
it's good enough. But I thought that approach was interesting. It certainly piqued my interest when I first read the manuscript a year ago. Just as kind of spacey exploration. And then another interesting approach to the book is about half the book is part of a series of poems called "Chant of the Nether Spheres," which is separated from the rest of the book. Which would you be interested in talking a bit more about "Chant of the Nether Spheres" and the sort of the conception of that work within a work, as it were?
Oh yeah. I mean it's hard for me to describe that like in words, because I feel like if I could describe it in words, then the poem wouldn't even exist. There's like an idea I keep coming back to that came from a movie. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, starring Gary Oldman. About Beethoven. The name of the movie is Immortal Beloved.
I haven't seen that, but I'll add it to my list.
That's a movie to see, because he's talking about music and what it means to him, and he says that like the ultimate goal is to put the listener in the mind of the composer. And I'm not sure I was just sort of guided by very abstract ideas about dreams and ancient Greece, and I was also listening to a lot of classical music at the time, like the symphonies of Anton Bruckner and Gustav Mahler, and a lot of similar stuff. And I was just fascinated by classical music, um, and that's really what inspired it.
That's an interesting thing to bring up, because I know you're a musician. There's actually a link to Chris's Bandcamp page in the description if you want to check out Boring Dream, his music project. I used to be a musician. I was a band kid throughout middle and high school.
What instrument did you play?
I wanted to play the tuba when I started out in, I think, third grade, but they had no tubas, so I got assigned the baritone horn. I eventually upgraded to a trombone, and
Oh,
I
wow.
eventually learned how to play guitar and bass, but I haven't touched an instrument in years. So, like, if I picked it up now, I'd be mediocre at best.
Yeah, I was a trombone player in high school.
Yeah, it was always fun talking to people. It's like, how do because the trombone has the slide. It's like, how do you know where to play what notes? And it's like, well, I mean, fourth position is right around where the tip of the horn is, and the rest you just kind of learn it by ear. Yeah, and it's good training if you want to move to, say, bass guitar, because it's the same scale. I mean, my big mistake was not really pursuing music more vociferously when I was in high school. I imagine I'd be a bit happier now if I had, but that's life.
Yeah, I mean, I wish that I was more serious about piano, like when I was younger, because I played for a while, probably about 10 years, like taking lessons and everything. Like I did piano and trombone, and then I quit music for a long time, and until like a couple of friends of mine kept telling me like that I should play music for some reason, and then I was like thinking about it, like yeah, maybe like eventually I'll get into music, and then like it just sort of hit me all of a sudden that that's what I got to do. Like I've got to get into music somehow.
Yeah, I can relate to that. And it's interesting that you brought up that you were listening a lot to classical music when you wrote to Chant of the Never Spheres, because classical music is. I listen to classical music sometimes, but it's not something you kind of get casually into. At least that's my interpretation of it. Like the average pop song, rock, metal, whatever. You can kind of throw that on as background noise, or if you're at the gym, you can put on some metal when you're lifting, and it doesn't really. And it just fits right in. But classical music is not something you could kind of just casually throw on. It's something that your brain has to kind of interpret and work over. Um, and now that you mention it, I can actually see some of that influence definitely in Chant of the Never Spheres, with the way it just kind of layers on themes and layers on imagery to sort of take the lead. Sorry.
Are you familiar with like Oswald Spengler?
Yes, Decline of the West.
Yeah. I mean, I have not read it, but I know that he's described classical music as like infinite, boundless space, I think.
Yeah, I think it was something like that. It's been so long since I read that book, since I can't really recall it from memory. I have a copy of Men and Technics in my bookshelf, but I haven't touched it yet. Though my understanding is that book is basically just about how technology is having a detrimental effect on humanity. But yeah, that's a good description of it.
Oh yeah. I get that like classical music, it can be sort of like intimidating, like especially like Gustav Mahler and Anton Bruckner. They both have, I think, 9 symphonies, and like they're long pieces of music, so it's like where do you sort of get started with it? But I mean, once I started listening to it, I was absolutely hooked.
Oh yeah. I mean, I will occasionally listen to Tchaikovsky, or I tend to gravitate towards the Romantic era of classical music just because it's the one that kind of speaks to me. If that makes any sense, I listen to some Mozart occasionally, but if when I listen to classical music, it's something where I have to kind of just sit down and take it in. Whereas, with a pop song or whatever, I could just play that as background noise when I'm working, and it doesn't really have it doesn't have the same oomph. You're not going to, regardless of what genre of music you're into, you're not going to. Most people are not going to turn that into like a listening experience where they just sit down and do nothing else.
Yeah,
particularly in this day and age where, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Particularly in this day and age where, you can, the flexibility of how you can listen to music is totally different than what it was 20 or 30 years ago.
I was going to say that I'm a little bit of the opposite, because like I put classical music on in the background like all the time, because like I can just put it on and listen to it like all day. But like anything with like someone singing, like I feel like I have to pay attention to what they're singing about, and that can get annoying. So I'd rather just listen to something without words.
That does make sense. I mean, I've noticed it in my case where it's like I can have some music on with like that has no vocals, like not necessarily classical, but like stuff like vaporwave or something like Explosions in the Sky, where it's all instruments and there's no vocals, and that won't affect my concentration. But if there's vocals, that can kind of break my concentration. It's like the brain kind of has like a different track for interpreting different types of sound, whereas like there's the voice, and voices and music are kind of go on different tracks, and you can kind of get your brain messed up. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Like I just listen to mostly stuff like without any singing or any vocals.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely get that. Actually, this is something I want to share quickly to kind of cycle back to Psyche and Spectre. I asked Manny Marrero of Expat Press to blurb your book, and he actually just sent in the blurb. This is a world debut. Quote: When Chris Moran toured through the Expat Features rotation, I was approached by several editors desperate to solicit him. Terror House gets the immoral privilege of placing his work in print, and it's a gift to poetry like no other. This is shrapnel, blunt and traumatic, and Moran explodes abstractions with boundless abandon. One of 2 or 3 truly essential contemporary poetry books around. Manuel Murrow writing about Psyche and Spectre.
Wow, that is great. I'm glad to hear that.
Definitely, and
Expat is awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Go check out expatpress.com and go check out all their books. Manny's actually he sent me another expat press loot box that will be here whenever Mexican EMS gets around to it. But that was nice of him. He's a great guy. He's a really great writer, and he really has an eye for talent. Thank you so much to Manny for that great blurb.
Nice. Yeah. I've read a couple books from Expat, and it's great stuff.
Definitely. We're coming up on an hour now, and I think we've covered a lot of material, and we've given the audience a lot of food for thought. Chris, is there anything else about Psyche and Spectre that you'd like to kind of impart to the audience to help them understand it a bit more, and perhaps motivate them to get out their credit cards and buy it when it goes on sale tomorrow morning?
Yeah, I just want to say that it's an awesome book, and that it's I would describe it as like abstract and dreamlike and metaphysical. I would shy away from words like psychedelic, because I'm not into drugs, and I'm against that sort of thing. But to say like that it's abstract and dreamlike and metaphysical, like that is how I see it, and I hope that people like it. It took a long time for it to get out. Most of it was written a long time ago, and I hope that people like it.
Yeah, I definitely did not use that. I didn't use that term in the description or whatnot because it's definitely not psychedelic. Like it's something that was very clearly written by a sober mind. If that makes any sense, it's about the attitude is of one who has total control of their senses. That's how I would describe Psyche and Spectre.
Yeah. Well, I know that we're coming up on an hour, but I'd sort of like to like turn the tables a little bit and ask you a couple questions, if that's cool.
Yeah, go right ahead.
I want to ask you like what made you fall in love with literature like when you were like a young man?
I can't really, I can't
Like
really think pinpoint.
or like specifically like poetry like when you were younger.
This is a bit easier. I mean, with literature in general, I can't pinpoint a specific like incidents. It's just that when I was in high school, I was kind of a loser, and I read a lot of books. I read far more books than a teenager should be allowed to read, or I read stuff like I went from my mom's collection and read stuff like Wuthering Heights and Ayn Rand and Ernest Hemingway and all this stuff. I read Charles Bukowski and Hunter Thompson and Louis Ferdinand Celine and Philip K. Dick. With regards to poetry, that's easier to talk about. Prior to starting Terror House, I really didn't have much of an interest in poetry. I wasn't against it, or I didn't dislike it, but my interpretation of poetry came from my experiences in college, and we would read stuff like I don't know, Sherman Alexie, another writing all these kind of whiny poems about life on the reservation. Not that that's there's interesting perspectives from that perspective, but he always came off as someone who was just incredibly whiny and was just had a career because college professors made students read his stuff.
Yeah, that's like something that you're forced to read and then you completely forget it like 2 weeks later.
Yeah. There's tons of other poets like that I had to read that I didn't really like, which kind of I don't want to say put me off poetry, but just kind of kept me from being interested in it. But before I started Terror House, I was a fan of websites like Tyrant and Fluland, and that kind of got me back into poetry. Just respecting it more as an art form because you got all these perspectives that you wouldn't read anywhere else. And now the irony is that I'm writing my own poetry chapbook, which
Nice.
may or may not see the light of the day before the end of the year, but it will. I'm almost finished with the first draft, so
Nice.
some people might be able to get to see that soon.
Like were there any like older historical poets that you sort of gravitated towards though, like I don't know, like John Keats or Percy Shelley or anyone like that?
In terms of that era, I like Lord Byron the most because his writing has the most energy and honesty. There's this is something I could rant about all day long, but there's a big divide between the earlier English romantic poets and the later ones. I cannot stand the earlier ones like Wordsworth and who's that other guy, Coleridge, whose poetry was very humorless and stilted. And it's kind of reflective in how they lived their lives. They all retreated to the Lake District because they were just terrified of what was going on at the continent at the time, which was the French Revolution. Whereas Lord Byron just kind of embraced all the insanity of the world. And, him and Percy Shelley were probably my favorite poets from that era. Just their poetry has that kind of visceral, unrelenting honesty that I kind of like.
I was obsessed with like all of that stuff like when I was young, and I would just read obsessively like those sort of like older poets and just like carry books around and memorize stuff and just read it like nonstop.
In terms of like more contemporary poets, from the 20th century, I like Frank O'Hara. I like Wallace Stevens, and I reluctantly like W.B. Yeats. I'm not a fan of.
Why do you say reluctantly?
He was a good writer. He was just absolutely insane with his conception of the world. This weird kind of this weird kind of Irish nationalism he cobbled together from reading all these pagan texts and
Did you ever read something by him called like A Vision, I think is the title of it?
Yes, yeah, I have read that. A Vision.
I have a copy of that somewhere. I can't find it right now. I'm looking at my shelf. Yeah, that is. I have not read the whole thing, but yeah.
Well, I kind of have a bone to pick with a lot of Irish writers of that era, because it was the era of Irish independence led to a rebirth and interest in Irish culture, which was bad for genuine writers and good for entrepreneurs. James Joyce is someone I think is extremely overrated, whereas Flann O'Brien is extremely underrated.
Yeah, James Joyce. I like the Portrait of the Artist, but the other stuff, it's well, I'm not a novelist though, so I shouldn't really judge too harshly. But I mean, Yeats is a great poet. Another poet that means a lot to me and means a lot to me more over time is actually D.H. Lawrence. Who I think is I think is personally I think is very underrated as a poet. I think that most people know him for his novels, but his poetry is actually like where the really good stuff is.
I'll have to check that out, because most people I've only read his novels, but I've never read his poetry.
His poetry is worth checking out.
Yeah, and as far as poets, I mentioned Bukowski earlier. Bukowski is great. I mean, I shy away from trying to talk about him as much, because you either have people who are trying to imitate him, which is annoying, and there are people who don't like him because he's sexist or whatever.
I mean, like I can totally see that with you, and I mean I've read him like. And I think of it as like entertainment, but it's like the greatest entertainment that you could get from reading like the good parts, like Tales of Ordinary Madness, or just like the poetry.
The thing that annoys me about people who like Bukowski, the people who try to imitate him, they think he was cool, when Bukowski basically just wrote about how pathetic his life was with the alcoholism and the transitory relationships and whatnot. There's an element of tragedy about it. Like, he wasn't writing simply to brag; he was writing to kind of lament his inability to make good life decisions.
Yeah,
like Women is a good his novel Women is a kind of a good case in point on that. But he's still a great writer. As much as some of his fans could be annoying.
Yeah, and like I think about him like working in the post office, and how I feel like it used to be sort of normal for writers to have like unusual jobs, whereas now everybody is just like looking at a computer screen all day, probably.
Yeah, I mean,
it's like I'm a machinist, like I'm doing industrial sort of stuff, so like I am thinking about Bukowski working in the post office, and like T.S. Eliot worked in a bank, I think. William Carlos Williams was a nurse. Like I'm trying to think of like other examples like that.
Lydia Lunch waited tables. Hunter Thompson was a copy boy for Sports Illustrated.
Yeah, it's just sort of interesting to think about like what people do like most of the day, and then like poetry is just like the thing that they do on the side.
Yeah, I mean, I do have a job that is pretty unusual. I can't discuss it for various reasons, but depending on how things go in the next 5 years, I may actually be able to write a book about it, because it's absolutely insane. I'll just put it like that. It's a great job, but I deal with a lot of crazy people. But then I dealt with a lot of crazy people over the course of my adult life, so it's not really that much of a change.
Interesting.
But did you have any other questions, Chris? I mean, you said you had like a couple of questions. I think.
Oh, well, I just wanted to ask you about like what sort of poets you gravitated towards like when you were younger. But I think we sort of covered that.
Cool, man. I mean, it was interesting. It was an interesting discussion. But well, we've gone over an hour now, and I think we always leave the audience wanting a little more. You know, if you want that little more, go and check out Psyche and Spectre. Chris, is there anything else you'd like to plug or promote? Any other work or websites you'd like people to check out?
Yeah, listen to the music of our unseen guest. Bandcamp.com.
Cool, man. I also have a link in the description to your Bandcamp page for Boring Dream. Go check that out if you'd like to listen to Chris's music. And of course, you can buy Psyche and Spectre when it comes out tomorrow morning, September 24th. For those of you who are listening after the fact, there will be a special launch week discount as with all of our other books. So buy early and you'll get the discount. Anyway, I've been talking to Chris Moran. As I said, he's the author of Psyche and Spectre. Go buy it. And I think that will cover it for this episode of Terror House Radio. You can check out my website at mattforney.com, which I don't update anymore, but it's still there. You can visit Terror House Magazine, terrorhousemag.com every day for our latest submissions. Books are at terrorhousepress.com. You can follow our social media links in the description. And of course, you can check out every episode of the show always at terrorhouseradio.com. Terror House Radio is produced by Bryden Proctor and presented by Katya Dag. Intro music by Zero Pulse. Illusion non coverandum. Don't let the bastards grind you down. I'm Matt Forney with Chris Moran, and we are out.